Today's alumni career story is Christopher de Mattos, who left INSEAD to be an equity analyst but went on to co-found RAB Capital, which was the first hedge fund manager to list in London in 2004. So you'd been an equity analyst. How did you make the jump from that kind of corporate job to co-found a hedge fund?
There were three of us who set the business up. Essentially, one who was raising the money, who was the marketer, one who was running the money, doing the investment, and I was running the business. So I was responsible for everything else, for all the infrastructure, operations, the finance, and so on. And when we started, it was a vibrant time in the markets. We knew a number of people who had set up successful hedge fund management businesses, and we thought that we could probably do that as well as they did. It was extremely remunerative at the time if you got it right, and we were able to set up with $14.5 million of investment. So we went to families, friends, and in fact one institution at the outset, and we put together $14.5 million into a fund. I think, again, serendipity comes into it. I mean, we were lucky in that when we set up, there were opportunities on the European equity markets, which was where we were investing. And the fund did particularly well, and that attracted a following and allowed us to grow very quickly. I mean, when we started, we had a single office, and our start-up interview with the regulator was scheduled. We didn't want to put it off, but actually at the time we hadn't finished refitting the office, so it was a building site. We'd only had one computer delivered, so it was sitting there on a packing box with one computer and a printer, and we were quizzed about how we were going to organise ourselves. We were quizzed on our financial projections and so on, and we sat there on deck chairs, because we hadn't actually had any office chairs delivered either, drinking tea with the regulator and chatting things through. Now, I think it would be a little different.
So you later did something quite pioneering in that you sought a listing for your hedge fund. How did that process compare to the kind of difficulty of setting the thing up in the first place?
I think it was more intense than starting the company. I mean, we'd grown to just under 40 employees at that stage, so it was not a complete start-up. We'd had some very successful investment performance. The funds had grown. I think we were, frankly, probably stretching it when we listed, but we knew that was something we wanted to do. We'd considered it when we set the business up, and we had managed the business differently from most of the hedge fund management businesses that were out there at the time. And two key things, I think, come to mind in that respect. One was that we decided we weren't going to run the business entirely for cash. So we had a concept that any gains, any surpluses we made were split equally between, as it were, labour and capital. So we retained half of any gains in the business, and we paid out the other half in bonuses. So that was one element which differentiated us, in that we did actually have a balance sheet that we were building up and that was becoming reasonably strong by that stage. And the other differentiating factor was that in our negotiations with employees, fund managers, we had no revenue sharing arrangements. We gave some guidelines, but there were no contractual agreements to share revenues. And the thought behind that was that if you have one fund, for example, that is particularly successful, then the revenue sharing arrangements can absorb a lot of the cash in the business, and not give enough to develop other funds and to grow the business into a more diversified investment management organisation. So those were two things which were very different from what most hedge funds were doing at the time, and that was we were the first pure hedge fund management business to list in London.
What was the process of seeking a listing like?
For me in particular, it meant 3 months of really hardly leaving the office. I don't think I had more than sort of 3 or 4 hours sleep over those few months. It was a very intensive process, and I think that was partly because we did it on the early side. So the people who we had hired were not sufficiently experienced, didn't know enough about the business to complete all the paperwork, to do all the due diligence, etc. So I was really the focal point for that. I was the only person who really knew how the whole business fitted together, and was in a position to go through all the due diligence and so on. And it was a pretty intensive process, and I think the level of the questioning, the due diligence behind a prospectus was something that I was broadly aware of as having worked on the sell side when I was working in investment banking, but going down to justifying every sentence in a sort of 100-page prospectus and putting together the evidence was quite extraordinary. And although we'd only been going for 4 years, we had 3 or 4 tables piled high with lever arch files with all the due diligence paperwork.
So INSEAD alumni may be watching this thinking, wow, this sounds like fun. How easy would it be to follow your example, do you think?
Well, I think firstly, if you're specifically talking about hedge funds, or let's go back actually, specifically in my case, yes, it was great fun. And we had, I think really like any small business that you start and that becomes successful, it's a very stimulating, interesting, fun experience. In terms of where we are today and what's required in order to do that, I think you have to go into investment management, into investment banking, into an area which will give you the skills and the background and the contacts to be able to do that. So it's not something where I would suggest you come straight from an MBA and say, right, I'm going to set up a hedge fund, because you won't find any investors. However good you are, people will want to see some sort of track record. So you need to build up a track record in the financial services industry, and then the opportunity may arise. As I say, I think at the moment the key barriers are firstly the capital that you need in the business, and you need to have a bigger regulatory compliance function than you did when we started. And you need to have everybody really understanding that and really being able to operate within the rules of the game. And secondly, you really need to have an institutional backer, somebody who is going to say, yes, okay, we like your strategy, we like what you've done, we like what you're planning, and we are prepared to put in 10, 20, 50, $100 million to back that, or even more. And I think those are critical success factors these days.